She's already given the intro a whole bunch of times, so that should, that should work. I think that should be fine.
Where was it?
Good. All right, Kelly, tell me one.
Go ahead.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You're set? Good, okay. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Loon Center. So my name is Harry Vogel. I'm a senior biologist and the director here at the Loon Preservation Committee. Just a few words of introduction and a little bit of background on the Loon Preservation Committee before I introduce Pam. So this is an organization that was begun in 1975, and it was begun because people had noticed that loons were becoming less common on our lakes throughout the state of New Hampshire. The thinking at that point was that if human activities had contributed to those declines, and it seemed pretty likely that they had, then human activities, if they were thoughtful and coordinated, could reverse those declines. And that's the hope and the philosophy on which this organization was formed. So our mission is to simply recover and then maintain a viable loon population throughout the state of New Hampshire, to monitor the health and the productivity of loons and loon populations as indicators of environmental quality, the health of our lakes and ponds, and then also to promote a greater appreciation and a wider awareness of not just loons, but the larger natural world. And so that's where our Thursday night nature talks come into play. We are very sad, in the COVID years, which I realize we're not quite out of yet, but in the depths of that, we had to give up our Thursday night nature talks. So we're happy to have brought them forward again this year, and to have a live audience as well as to be streaming to the web as well as we're able. So I think that you're all going to enjoy Pam's talk tonight. A very quick piece of information, or a couple of pieces of information on Pam. So she's been with New Hampshire Audubon for 22 years. She is the senior conservation biologist. Close enough, good. And she's well respected by everyone in the birding community, and in fact New Hampshire Fish and Game, although the state of New Hampshire doesn't have an official state ornithologist, everybody knows that Pam is our state ornithologist as far as that goes. So please join me in welcoming New Hampshire's unofficial state ornithologist and my friend Pam Hunt.
Thank you. All right. Hello, everybody. Hello, to people who are somewhere in cyberspace. And we'll just get this thing show on the road and see if this little thing works.
Second Pam, I think.
What are we doing?
Try again.
Ha! Magic! So, for those of you who've not been at one of my talks before, they tend to be a little more interactive than you might like. Because I always start by asking you questions, and you have to help me, because I forget that I'm getting old, and I forget these things. So when you hear about bird migration, what is migration? Think there's like 3 words here we need, and this always doesn't work, but I always do it because I'm kind of programmed to give these talks this way. But there are 3 things that are required to really call something migration, and people just start throwing answers out. For folks at home, sorry. But anybody in the audience, live audience, can throw out things like, what are some of the characteristics of migration? Let's put it that way. And I won't move forward until I at least get one. So this is like your chance to get it out of your system.
Season change.
Okay, we'll get to that one later. You're kind of the game. You get a bonus point later.
Oh, all right.
I usually give out free cookies, but there's none. But you can keep track of them and get them from LPC another time.
Is it traveling from like north to south, going a distance to go from different parts of the world?
You get a cookie too, partially. You get half a cookie. So you see, build off these folks, right? This is, like I said, it's interactive. We've got 2 of them now, I think. I don't have preview view, so I can't remember what I've written down here. Let's just do it. You guys are being hard. Bing! There's your point.
I want a pie.
You missed the round trip part. You were close, right? If you just go from here to there, that's not migration. That's called dispersal biology. It's like I grew up here. I grew up in New York, and now I live in New Hampshire. I dispersed to New Hampshire. But people, who here is a summer person? Right, so you're migrants, right? You go to Florida or in the winter, you come back there, and you know when you're going to do it. So it happens at the same time every year, more or less. So that's what migration is. It is distinct from other types of animal movement. And it usually, you know, individuals migrate, but it really happens when the whole species kind of thing. Okay, did good there. So people who haven't answered yet are going to be on the spot a little more here. Why do they migrate? If somebody gets the ultimate answer to this the first time, they get a piece of pie.
Weather.
That's food is one of them, but you know, chickadees don't migrate. There's plenty of food here for chickadees in winter, isn't there? Someone also said weather. So that's good. You got to. So why do those things vary? Sorry?
Breeding.
No, why does food and weather vary? What's that?
Well,
What's
because
causing
winter
that?
comes on and their food source changes and
Yeah.
they have to go to a place where the food is, right?
And if their food is something that they can't have here. But the ultimate reason, no one ever gets this, I think someone might have recently, birds migrate because the earth tilts. So think about that for a second. That's why we have seasons. If we didn't have a tilted earth, we'd always have, you know, the exact same weather all year long. So this is why birds migrate. So in the northern hemisphere, when we're facing the sun, it's warmer, and in the winter, it's colder, and some of these food sources are just not there, and if you can't survive on seeds or little tiny bugs and crevices of bark, then you're going to get that out of Dodge and go somewhere else. So people ask you, why do birds migrate? Say, because the earth tilts, and then see if they can figure it out. You can really mess with their brains. Okay, another question! It's going to be fewer of these in a second. How do birds migrate? Yes, no, that's not the answer. It's like, when we think about going from point A to point B, how do we do it? And no, we don't flap our wings either, but it's like, functionally, or sort of, how do we know what we're doing?
They navigate, they have a navigation system, right?
This guy's getting the cookies right and left. You guys have enough?
You're gonna have to share.
So we have to navigate and we have to orient. Like our phones do this for us now, right? We're all pretty stupid that way. But if you're going to go home tonight, hopefully you don't need to use your phone to get home, right? You know how to get from here to your house. If not, well, you've got your phone. But we do that because we've got, we know landmarks. That's what navigation is. Navigation is knowing where to turn, and it's a map. Navigation is a map. If I give everybody a map right now and said, okay, you guys need to go to Island Pond, Vermont, to pick a random location that I know about. Some of you may know about it. If I give you a map, do you know how to get there?
Yeah.
Yes.
Have you been there before? How do you know how to use the map? There's one other piece, and that's orientation. You need to know which way the map is up, which way is north. If you hold the map upside down, you're going to go the wrong direction. If you don't know where north is, and line north on a map of the north end of the world, you're not going to go the right direction. So migrating needs person to know both of those things to get somewhere. And here comes the person that's going to be late. We'll ask them a question. The person they walk in. And in our parlance, those are a map and a compass. Birds have both. We know a lot about bird compasses, which we'll talk about. We know less about bird maps, which we will also talk about. Pull up a chair. You missed the tough questions. I'll ask you later.
Well, there are more to come, right?
Oh yeah, like there's every single slide's a question right now. But now I'm going to answer them on the same slide, so you're kind of a little. I can sort of let you guys slack for a little bit. So, how do we orient? We know which way the sun rises, right? Sun rises in the east, sets in the west. So birds do the same thing, right? Here comes the sun. Here it comes. So we kind of just know that. Well, birds know that too. They're not stupid. They've been evolving for millions of years. And it turns out, if it's nighttime, what do we do to know which way north is?
Stars.
North star. Boom. Birds do that too. We'll explain how they know these things in a second. But birds use essentially stellar cues, so sun and stars, to know which way north is. And they can recalibrate that compass every single morning when the sun rises. What if it's cloudy? They really aren't sure where the sun rising is. They have another special feature. Whoops, let's go ahead. I should change the order of these slides. Birds can detect polarized light. And people figured this out by actually making little tiny polarized contacts and putting them on birds. That they kind of reverse the polarization of light, and they would get confused about where, because if it's dark out, if it's like cloudy and the sun, you can't really see where the glow is on the horizon, the light polarization is still different just because the light is just starting to come up above the horizon. So birds can see that, and they can tell which way east and west is because of the shift in the light polarization. But the other thing is, the really cool thing that we can't do, I guess we can't detect polarized light very well either, is they have magnetic structures in their brains that basically orient towards the North Pole. Not, then like it's like little tiny magnets in their heads doing this, but there's things that are connected to the nervous system that actually sense the Earth's magnetic field, which is pretty bleeping cool if you think about it. People have put little experiments with pigeons where they put little magnetic coils on their heads and they don't know what they're doing. You can put birds in magnetic anomalies, like there's this weird places on Earth where compasses point the wrong direction. You can release homing pigeons in those and they don't know what they're doing until they get out of the radius of that sort of stuff. So birds, you know, if it's dark and cloudy or I can't see any other things, they always have this backup from the magnetic field, which is pretty cool. And so when we learn these sort of things, is something this guy at Cornell many years ago, Stephen Emlyn, invented called an M1 funnel. And what it all looks like is a little bird sitting in the cone made of blotter paper kind of thing. And in the bottom, there's an ink pad, and then there's a screen there so it can't fall away. And you stick the bird in that. And when birds want to migrate, they kind of flutter around. And what it's going to do is going to get its feet dirty on the ink pad and leave little footprints on that cone. Are you following that? It's pretty cool. And you can determine which direction the bird is trying to go. So you take this bird in a cone, you stick it in a planetarium, and mess with the sky, or mess with polarized light, or whatever you want to do, and you can see how the bird moves things around. So people have done experiments in planetariums where they actually have, you know, the stars up there, and they can take out the North Star, and birds just don't know what they're doing. There you'll see little footprints all over the place rather than a not clear direction. So you can hear this is a bird orienting north in that case, or orienting south in spring and fall. But if you change the cues so the cues that they theoretically need aren't there, then they're going to just be scattershot. So we learned very quickly, very easily actually, think about it, very brilliant little solution there to figure out how to measure bird migration. That people use the same technology, high-tech stuff, even now to look at some of these other questions I'll be explaining as we go along. So M1 funnels are a pretty fun little, you can make one in your home, but you can't because you can't not all have birds in your house. So that we know how they orient. You know, they can use magnetic cues, they can use light. But how do they know how to get back? How does, you know, the loon that nests down on Mizaki right around here, since I'll mention loons at least once, you keep very happy. How does it know where that nest territory is next spring? It leaves and goes down to the Atlantic Ocean somewhere in the winter. Comes back here, oh yeah, there it is. There's that raft, or there's that little island, that's perfect. That's the same place I was. How the hell does it know that? You know, the same reason we know where our houses are, presumably. Lots of different things they can do. Landmarks, birds will follow rivers, waterfowl in particular, follow rivers, you know, we'll talk about that in a second. Follow coastlines, follow ridge lines, you know, some species, larger birds that live a long time, like geese and cranes, will actually learn their route from their parents. That, of course, begs the question, where do the parents learn it? So you have to go back millions of years of generations and don't know the answer still, but approximately birds will learn that route. They have to follow their parents on their first migration. But that loon doesn't do that. You know, the little warblers that we start seeing, some of those little guys are like, whoa, I just hatched out. I'm going to Costa Rica, cool. How the hell did I get there? They just do. The really fun stuff, which I got a couple of cool little slides here about, is some work with genetics and inherent navigation abilities, that birds just have some sort of ability to know what they're doing. Probably based on honing these other things over generations and generations. So the first little guy is this little European warbler called a black cap. On all the maps we're going to see yellowish, orange is breeding range, blue is winter, and if there's a purple color, it means it's there both all year long in some way or another. So black caps breed in Western Europe, winter in Africa, increasingly wintering in parts of Western Europe. And what people know from banding studies and other things, we'll talk about that in a bit, is that birds from the western part of the continent winter in the western part of Africa, and birds in the eastern part winter in the eastern part of Africa. Because what would be bad about going straight south?
That's
The
great.
Sahara Desert.
I think I heard both of them, right? There's a big ocean there, well, not a really big one. The Mediterranean is there and the Sahara is there. Sahara is probably really bad because it's just a giant desert with no food. The Mediterranean is not quite as bad, it's not super wide, but it's still a big expanse without any food. So a lot of birds tend to go around bodies of water like that. So what people did was a really fun study where they actually hybridized blackcaps from the western and eastern portion of the range with each other. And they put them in emerald funnels, essentially, and they did that. They didn't go anywhere, right? They're still in the lab, right? Look, don't worry, they're safe. They probably, some of them would make it. Birds do some amazing things that we'll see. But they're genetically, they kind of had some mixed genetics there that they actually split that difference. And so obviously birds that did that over generations and generations would be more likely to die, whereas birds that go to the sides are more likely to live. And so blackcaps kind of lucked out in that regard. Skip that particular piece. That's not really relevant. Another warbler, same situation. Big Western European range, African winter range. A little different study here. They put these guys in cages again and watch what they did. And they kind of do this. They kind of go going, uh-oh, if it does that, what's happening? If it keeps on that southwesterly bearing, what's the next point of land?
Antarctica.
Brazil, which is pretty far away for a bird about this big. So they don't want to go to Brazil. Brazil's a bad place for them because they're not going to get there. So instead, they're going to do that. Come on. Right? So at some point, they need to take a left. And it turns out they're in a cage in, let's say, France, and they're flying and flying and flying, and then they haven't moved, right? They're still in their cage. But their internal calendar says, oh, time to take that left. And so they will fly southwest for 3 or 4 days, and then change their orientation without having moved to go south, and happily make it to West Africa and survive that migration journey. So again, so there's a genetic map in their head, which we can't do. I guess we can after a while. Like I know how to get home, without my phone, but it's the same principle. So why birds aren't any smarter than us? They're probably smarter. So that's that one. So another piece of navigate. I guess that's all for navigation. Okay, let's shift gears. Some migration physiology. This is pretty impressive stuff. These are tiny little birds, in many cases, that are flying huge distances. And they do that with fat. They eat lots and lots of food, they get lots and lots of fat. All that yellow is fat. Think about when you get a chicken, all that yellow stuff around the wings and the edge of the breast, that's fat. Chickens aren't migrating, but imagine a little tiny bird the size of a chickadee that doubles its weight in fat so they can migrate, and it burns that fat as energy as it goes. A lot of smaller birds in particular, migrate at night. And what's really fun, it's a bit early for this now, but sometimes starting in September, go outside at night and listen, like after 9 o'clock at night. And you might start hearing little tiny chirp notes. Chirp. Now these are thrushes, warblers, sparrows that are calling as they fly overhead. So what might be a benefit to these little birds of migrating at night? There's at least 4. If you can get 2 of them, I'll be happy.
Less predation?
Less predation. This guy's going for it. You can't answer another one, though.
Okay.
What's the second one? This side's been pretty quiet. I can tell these things, It's a teacher. Anybody this side want to guess what might benefit of migrating at night?
Staying cooler?
Oh, well done. She shows up, a little late, that's fine. But she knows her stuff. So there's 2 of them. Boom! The other one's just less windy at night. And the other way, if it's dark, you need to see what you're eating. You can land in the morning, get some yummy food, and then rest later in the day. So there's fewer predators, definitely cooler. So you're doing this, right? You're generating a lot of heat. So if you have a way of dissipating that heat through the cooler air, then you're in a good position. So good job on that one. I guess that's so. I'm not a meteorologist, nor do I play one on TV. And that joke is probably just getting older and older because people don't watch TV anymore. But weather is hugely important for bird migration because they will take whatever they can to minimize the amount of work they have to do. So tailwinds are really important. You don't want to be a bird the size of a chickadee flying into a headwind for 300 miles or something like that. So when we both those of us are birders that like studying birds or bird migration, this time of year we start watching weather maps and looking at the weather predictions, and we look for the wind direction. Because we've got a nice cold front coming through in the fall, it means we get some nice strong northwest winds. Here's a nice little map again. And that's going to push birds that are coming from the north to the south. Northeast winds are good too, but a nice warm front moving north from the middle Atlantic, that's a headwind. You don't want to fly into that. So in the fall, you're looking for cold fronts and cold northwest, northeast winds. And in spring, it's the opposite. You wait for these nice warm flushes, and then it's like a little freight train, and birds just follow those warm wind currents and warm air systems north to their breeding grounds. Sometimes weather is not their friend. So a couple years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, Hurricane Isaias blasted up the eastern seaboard. It did this. This is not a migratory bird story, but migratory birds have to deal with this every fall. And that's its route. And these are locations of tropical seabirds that were picked up by the hurricane and brought north. And one of them, it's a sooty tern, breeds in the Caribbean, ended up in Deerfield, New Hampshire 2 years ago, August 6th. It was exhausted. It landed on someone's pontoon boat, sat there all night, and the next morning it was gone. So presumably it recovered, and then had to figure out how the hell did I get back to Bermuda? And presumably we did, because it wasn't there, it wasn't dead in the boat. A lot of birds die in this. But migratory birds that are going south at this time of year are going to run into hurricanes and get blown off course, get killed. Some birds, whimbrel, this is a big sandpiper. There was a whimbrel that was tagged in Virginia many, many years ago. Her name was Hope. She spent the winter every year in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. She flew through 2 hurricanes in the 5 or 6 years that she was being tracked to get to St. Croix. And then a hurricane hit St. Croix, but she was there, and she found it passing, unfortunately. So that kind of bad weather can be a terrible thing for birds during migration. Closer to home, this is a super bonus quiz. Anybody know what this is?
It's a warbler.
It is a warbler. That's not good enough, though. You've got enough cookies now anyway. Yeah, if you get it, you can put a frosting on it for you somehow. It's thinking really hard. We'll talk about it later. It's a blackpoll warbler. Yeah, it's a confusing fall warbler. This bird is actually sitting at the window at the Mount Washington Observatory.
Wow.
At night, because it's migrating at night, and it's all light there. And maybe it was cloudy, and birds so if it's cloudy and they can't see the stars, there's other sources of light that disorients them. We'll talk about that again in a bit, in the end. And so it sees light, and it goes towards the light, and sometimes they die against windows, sometimes they die by the billions. This wasn't billions, that's a lot of birds. This is literally hundreds. This was on cruise ships. This is early in COVID. These cruise ships are just parked off of Florida somewhere because they weren't being used for some reason. And it must have been lit up at night, and there must have been some bad low cloud cover and stuff, and these birds got disoriented. They flew around and they ended up crashing into the boat and hitting parts of the boat. So bad weather, in combination with especially human structures, can be really dangerous to migration. And you can actually identify half of these little warblers. It's just very, very sad. So we'll skip on to some better stuff. So how do we study migration? There's some really cool things here. In this case, these are people just watching it. They're out watching. But there's lots of, that's pretty low tech and you can't follow the same bird. Okay, I'm ready, I'm going to keep up with you. No, it's going to be in Costa Rica before you can get to Massachusetts. So we do other things. People have heard of bird banding, right? We put these little bands on birds' legs, we let them go and hope the hell someone finds it. Not very efficient, but it does work. We've got bad recoveries, for big birds like loons there, I said loons twice. You can actually read them in the field, say, oh, that's got a green band with a WZ on it or whatever. It's, oh, that's the one that was banded up in Newfound Lake or blah, blah, blah. But if someone finds a bird dead or catches it again, you can tell, oh, that was here, and we can actually connect the dots. It's a lot of work to connect those dots. So in more recent years, we've come up with way better ways of doing this. This is a little thing called a geolocator. It's a little backpack that the bird has now around its legs. This is a little thing that's sensitive to light. These are getting to the point that these are kind of old-fashioned now, so we'll get to. They record day length. And from day length, you can get latitude and longitude. Right, because you know when the sun rises and the sun sets, that gives you your longitude, and the length of the day gives you latitude, except for on the equinoxes, which are really annoying. And you can catch, if you catch this bird again, so ideally, you will put this thing on the bird in the summer on the breeding grounds, or in the winter grounds. It flies, migrates, comes back to the same spot. You catch it again, that's tricky. You take the thing off and you download the data, and you can learn, this is a big one, on the willet. And this is actually one of the maps you can get from, I think it might be that willet, or a willet, that was banded, tagged in Massachusetts, and it flew over the ocean down to South America, spent the winter down there, came back up the coast. It might not be the willet, because I don't think they spent time in there. This might have been something else. Whatever it was, you can actually get these little points at various points along the route and kind of figure where it's going. But if you catch the bird again, that's still not the most efficient way of doing things. I've got to be very careful where I plant this. So people use wide radio telemetry, which also requires somebody on the ground, usually with an antenna that picks up the signal from the bird's transmitter. And again, you can, if you are tracking the birds, you can see when they leave and so forth, and get nice little naps like these sparrows. But the newest, coolest thing is this. And everybody can try, it's not hard to remember this, you can just Google it. There's a company called Modus, which is not related to this at all. I don't know what they do, but Modus is this program that people in Canada invented to track birds passively. Birds still get a little radio transmitter on their backs. It doesn't last very long because they're tiny. These things can't be too heavy, otherwise the birds get their flight impaired. But there's a system of receiver antennas all over the damn place. Every year there's more. This is just the Northeast. They're in South Africa, they're in South America now, they're in Australia, Europe. Most of them in the Northeast because it started in Ontario. And these things have little radio receivers at each of these stations that can basically detect one of these tags if it just flies by. So it's like a top of the speed trap. Oh, yep, that was the red star. Well, that was tag number 7DD49, whatever it was. And then that's connected back to the database. Oh yeah, that was the red star. That was banded in Ontario on June 3rd, and it passed through Pittsburgh on June 8th, or whatever, I made that up. It's really, and what we're trying to do now, Audubon is heavily involved in this, is creating these what they call fences, which are lines that cut across the migration route, so that there's a chance that any bird flying across that thing is going to get picked up by one of those towers. So we've got this nice little, there's one right here, and that's either in Meredith or Ashland, because I literally made this slide this morning, because I thought, okay, I need to put Modus in here. And that's the closest Modus station to LPC, and here's data. This black and white warbler was banded in Jamaica this March. It stayed in Jamaica until May 3rd, because they had a little station that was detected, so they can tell when it leaves to the day. Because it's got a little tiny territory in Jamaica, and when it leaves, oh, the signal's gone. The bird left. It showed up in Virginia on May 15th, Pennsylvania May 16th, and Ashland on the 17th. And if you go to Modus and you start poking around, you can make these little maps for any bird that's been detected at any station. And some of them are really cool. That was just like, there's a pipit that was banded in Quebec sometime last year, that it actually does this. It came down here, hit northern Hampshire, hit 3 New Hampshire sites, and then up in Pennsylvania somewhere. So you can actually get the real time, how fast is it traveling between 2 points. Very cool stuff. I literally spent like an hour after I made this slide looking at other data for other birds. So yeah, play with that the entire time. The other really cool thing that I look at religiously this time of year is weather radar. Because what are birds made out of? There's a tricky question.
Water.
Water.
Yeah.
What does Doppler radar detect? Water. Those are a composite image of all the Doppler radars. I don't know what the date was, October 3rd, 2010. Those are all birds. This is weather. That's weather. That's weather. That little red spot's a thunderstorm. All the little blue concentric circle things are birds. So as the birds take off at night, they've been hanging out all day, right? They migrate at night. They all rise. As they rise from the ground, the radar is kind of doing this. Right? It's sound effect, exactly what it sounds like. As they rise, they eventually hit that radar beam. And as more and more rise, they hit more of the beam. So as they get higher, you get this concentric circle effect. And people actually can use these data to look at, I look at these maps, I look at the radar stations for Portland, Maine, and Boston every morning on line bed in September. Was there a migration last night? And this is what it looks like. This is, I can't put the date again. Can't quite see it, maybe I didn't count. So this is a little an animation essentially of the Portland, Maine radar and one really nice migration night. So that's basically ground clutter, it's like moisture in the air. But then all of a sudden things start happening as the birds start getting up.
Wow.
And you can see, you might even be able to see which time you can guess which time of year this is by the preponderance direction of the movement.
Oh, yeah,
They're kind of moving north.
yeah.
Oops. So yeah, so you can, there we go. So yeah, so they're getting up, going up, going up, boom. It doesn't usually get better than green, because there's not as much moisture in a bunch of birds as there is in a thunderstorm. But you can actually see this happening. And people have used this technology to map out, where the birds are coming from on the ground and look at habitat associations where it's forested and that's just not forested. A couple of years ago, I may have heard the big paper that made, 3 years ago now, the 3 billion birds paper. Some of that data was based on radar. They looked at archived radar images from 10, 15 years ago. And how intense is the migration? And it's not as intense. And if you want more on that, Birdcast is why I always go in the morning and fall. It's very simple. You can actually get predictions, like by county, how many birds are expected based on the weather. And then you can check it the next morning. Sometimes they're way off. But it's very, very fun. Okay. Boom. Any questions about some of that mechanics of migration and how we study it, how birds know what they're doing? Because I need a drink. And then we'll jump into the storytelling.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, and maybe you said this before I got here, but, so if the bird is traveling in the one direction, I think I saw on one of the slides a little bit ago, so the bird travels, let's say this way, down south or wherever he or she goes. When they make the return, do they travel the same route or a different route?
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
So, yeah, you didn't show up too late for that? Then nobody did. We've even gone there yet.
Gotcha.
The answer is yes. They do whatever they got all sorts of points of doing it. So any questions that aren't psychic? Like, oh yeah, I'll answer that in a second. If not, we will look at examples of migratory pathways. Same deal. So we'll do a bunch of species, and maybe if we have time, I can pick a species, I'll tell you what it does. So here we go, you've probably heard of the flyways, right? Flyways are a thing that are geographically based where birds the population goes up and down the same way. I'm partially answering your question, right? So snow geese breed in the Arctic, they winter in sort of coastal areas in US and Mexico, and they basically, how far east or west you are determines how far east and west you breed. They basically just go up and down. So there's ones that go down the Atlantic coast, on the Atlantic flyway, some go down Mississippi, in the Mississippi flyway, some go down the sort of Great Plains in the Central flyway, and I didn't put a thing there, but a few would go down the Pacific coast in the Pacific flyway. So these birds are just following appropriate habitat because they're waterfowl. They need wetlands and grain fields to feed on. They're just moving north and south on the same route. Not very exciting, but it's the sort of standard migration thing. But a lot of things do things differently. So broadwing hawks breed in the eastern US in forest. They winter in South America. And who knows how broadwing hawks, what their route looks like. They're pretty popular bird. People go hawk watching. You can see thousands of them in a day.
We have some in our neighborhood.
Yeah,
Nesting
they
here.
breed here. They'll be leaving in a month, and then they'll be all gone.
Do they go across the Caribbean? Is that?
That's what I'm hoping people say because it's wrong. So you still get your cookies though. Because, so yeah, they do not, it seems like that'd be a pretty straight line, right? But how do hawks migrate?
Thermals,
Right, they ride warm air currents, or rising warm air currents. There aren't thermals over water. It just doesn't happen because water is not a flat heating surface. And so they avoid it. They just go around the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. So what's really cool about this is that as a result, they get concentrated as they go. So, you can go hawk watching, in the lakes region in the fall, and, on a good day, you might see 5, 6, 10,000 broadwing hawks go over in mid-September. That's pretty cool when you do. You go to Veracruz, Mexico, and you can see 200,000 in a day. I was down there 2006 for a conference, and we went up to this hawk watch spot in Veracruz, and that day they saw 265,000 hawks. We had to leave. We go down to our bus. One of the people on the tour had wandered off to go to his shop, so we sat in the street looking up, waiting for them to come back, and had like 5,000 just in 10 minutes. And they just keep piling up, and you go to Panama and Costa Rica, it's even more of them. And then they all spread out into South America. But they're all just funneling along, the ridge lines, avoiding the water. So as the continent gets narrower, they all get squished into one thing. So if you ever Mexico or Costa Rica or Panama in October, go one of these hawk watches and get your mind going. I should have put this one first, because this is what people say, oh yeah, they go straight to the Caribbean, because that's what they do. And then I could have put the broadwing hawk in, and people say, oh, they do the same thing, but oh, you're wrong. So, that's that was not this. A lot of it's pretty straightforward. Here's my buddy. We saw one of these a minute ago. They wintered down here. And I can ask you again, unless you know this story, you're going to be wrong. How do they get there? Yeah, okay, I guess Jay knows. Yeah. Look at this. Every black hole warbler in North America, from Alaska, Newfoundland, they're on Newfoundland, I don't know why it's not colored and I screwed that up, kind of congregates in the fall in the Northeast, like between Virginia and Nova Scotia. They get there, they chow down, they spend a couple weeks, they double their weight. Like, this is a thing that birds do, close to doubling their weight. So imagine you weigh half a gram, which isn't very much. No, not half a gram, half an ounce, which still isn't very much. You double your weight, so you weigh an ounce now. You're and then you say, okay, here comes a tailwind, I'm going to fly it over the Atlantic Ocean for 3 days. It can't stop, right? There's nothing, they can't land there because guess what? There's water there. There's tuna and mackerel, other big nasty predators. And there's no bugs to eat, so they basically just keep flying. It takes them 3 days, plus or minus, to fly that non-stop. So this is what I say. When they get to the Caribbean, they often start burning muscle. You catch them in Puerto Rico and they're below factory mass. Because they start to metabolize their muscle. So shit. Oh yeah, so the analogy is imperfect, but I usually say, okay, you've got 2 weeks, double your weight. People can't do that. Thankfully, they would do that. And then run to South America without stopping reading. Physically impossible. And then in the spring they do a different thing. Because the prevailing winds here are northeast-west. Yes, the cool point is this point where they turn is where the trade winds kick in, and the trade winds are coming from the northeast, and that pushes them slowly back towards South America. So I'm using 2 different wind things to do this. And in the spring, they just take the warm, easy route up the middle and then spread out when they get up here. And it's a lot faster and it's a little slower because they can just take their time. There's been a bunch of cool black pole warblers tagged in Colombia, right where the green arrow picks here, which is a major departure point for migrants in the spring. And they put a bunch of those Mortis tags on black pole warblers. One of them was detected in Maxapeasic Center in Auburn this spring. This is pretty cool. So that's the black pole warbler. Arctic tern. People probably know about the Arctic tern. It's like often touted as the marathon champion of migratory birds. I still think black pole warblers might be because Arctic terns are a lot bigger. Arctic terns So they winter in the Antarctic. So basically they see more daylight than any other bird on the planet. They're up here in the summer where it's sometimes close to 24 hours of sunlight. They go down here in the winter where it's close to 24 hours of sunlight. And they do it by crossing the Atlantic over to Europe, meeting up with other ones, going down to South America, hanging out there, and then coming back again. They make a giant figure eight around the Atlantic. Some of them might sneak into the Pacific and go up the edge of the Pacific as well. The ones in Alaska certainly do. But it's a 24,000-mile trip. But of course, unlike the black-billed warbler, what do terns eat? Fish. And can terns land on the water?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they kind of can stop and do stuff on the way. So yeah, they go a long ways, but they get to take breaks and eat and stuff. They're still pretty cool. And then there's this, oh, not yet, a couple of shorebird studies. Shorebirds are actually some of the famous migratory birds because they make some really long distance migrations. Our red knot, you get up in the Arctic, winters in southern South America. And in spring, we'll focus on spring, people may have heard about these guys. They have a series of very important what we call stopover sites, where the whole population leaves, goes to one spot, feeds there for a while, goes to another spot, feeds there for a while, and goes to another spot. And those can be very critical for conservation purposes, and the red knots kind of have 3 of them. There's one in Brazil, there's another one in Venezuela, and there's a really important one in Delaware Bay in the eastern US, where they stop in May and eat horseshoe crab eggs. And this is a 9,000-mile stop with basically 3 stops. So each of these journeys is pretty big. They're a big bird, but they, so what problem with horseshoe crabs and knots is this horseshoe crab declines have happened because of over-harvesting for medical purposes and bait. There's fewer and fewer horseshoe crabs, therefore fewer eggs, which means these birds that might need a ton of food to get nice and chubby to make that last leg are more compromised, and red knot populations are declining, possibly because of issues facing them on these real stopover sites along the way. Another shorebird, which we don't have around here, is the bar-tailed godwit. And this particular one breeds in the Arctic. This particular story is one that was tagged in Alaska and flew nonstop to New Zealand.
Wow.
So, and like the black-billed warbler, they cannot land on the water. They cannot, there's certainly no mud flats to poke their bill into across the Pacific Ocean. So a 6,600-mile non-stop flight. And that's because we put a tag on this bird that actually gave out satellite signals. You could track it the entire way because it's big enough to have a big tag on it. And then in spring, they go up to the East China Sea, hang out there for a long time, getting chubby again, getting ready to go back to Alaska for the spring. So some of these journeys are just global. Let's go. Oh, this was a boring one. That's what robins do. But they migrate, right? We see people, you probably, notice this. Robins are suddenly becoming pretty regular, right? We see them all winter long. They used to leave, now they're not. That's probably climate change related or something else. But they do migrate, and the ones we see here in the winter are probably different than the ones we see here in the summer, because their whole population just sort of shifts. It's like a little subtle, okay, well, so I'll just move 100 miles south. Or, well, the ones up here really take off because they don't like it up here at all. But right around here, we're in that zone where there's some from farther north, winter here, ours from a little far south, and they come back again in the spring. That's, that's what we call everything we've talked about so far is what we call long distance migration. This is definitely what we call short distance migration. Phoebe's kind of a little more extreme where they all basically leave, but they went to winter in the southern United States. Another example of a short distance migration, this is kind of like almost what loons do, except that these guys can often do it without flying. Because they breed on nice rocky rivers in eastern and western North America, and they winter on the ocean. And literally, the ones from like Labrador and British Columbia might just float down the river and end up in the ocean and say, hey, this is good. And in the spring, they might fly off again because it's a little easier. But yeah, they don't go very far, but they have to go to where obviously the rivers are going to get very cold and not much food in the middle there. There are some birds that are migratory but are less predictable. We call these eruptive species: crossbills, redpolls, pine grosbeaks, and waxwings. They're almost all northern species that have a defined breeding range and then a defined winter range. But in some years, they go farther. This winter, here to here first, we should have more Bohemian waxwings around because it's a 2-year cycle. They depend on what the fruit crop is like in the normal winter range. If it's not very good, they will continue farther south, just like crossbills and redbills and nuthatches. Also expected in higher numbers this winter because their food crops are biennial, and it's going to be, there's already crossbills and redbills and nuthatches showing up in parts of New Hampshire that don't normally have them. So these eruptive species are a little less predictable over 2 or 3 years. They're going to move. How far they move, where they move isn't always guaranteed, but they will move someplace they don't normally show up to capitalize on shifting food resources. Not all birds migrate north to south in the fall. Some migrate south to north in the winter. So Wilson's storm petrel, if you're on a whale watch this summer, you'll have seen them probably. They breed on islands in the extreme South Atlantic. They winter in the North Atlantic because they basically everything's flipped, right? The earth tilts, they got the opposite deal. In the winter down there, it's cold and dark and miserable. Here, it's nice and sunny and full of along the plankton. So these guys basically just move up and down the Atlantic Ocean, but our summer is their winter. As is the case for a songbird, there aren't very many what we call austral migrants. This is an austral migrant among land birds, birds that move north in their winters. So why are there fewer austral migrants than, I guess, northern migrants, boreal migrants, I guess might be the term? Any guesses? This is a geography question. The map is the answer.
More land at north?
It's more land at north. There are just more species that are, whoops, cookie. There's more Arctic and North temperate land in the Northern Hemisphere. You know, the Tropic of Capricorn is like, whichever one it is pretty far south. Because there's a lot of water down here. There's no water up here. It's all land almost to the North Pole, relatively speaking. So there's just a larger land mass to have migratory birds evolve in than in the Southern Hemisphere. So, but in the Southern Hemisphere, there's a few that breed in, you know, Southern South America and go all the way to Northern South America in their winter. Occasionally, this happens in both directions, they might miss up, because birds' navigation systems aren't perfect. And sometimes they keep going. And so, sometimes in spring, their winter, fork-tailed flycatchers show up in New England. They're totally lost, and probably don't make it back, because it's a long way to go back to where they're already messed up compass, they might not even know where they are. But yeah, vagrant birds are usually because they have some sort of weird error in that whole genetic compass navigation system we talked about before. Actually, a little funny back black hole orbit story. So remember, black hole orbits do this, right? Black hole orbits are not irregular in Southern California in the fall. So that would mean that some black hole orbits are kind of going potentially 90 degrees off, right? They're going this way, some of them are going that way. And they actually put them in eminent funnels, and guess what? They work. If they kept going that way, they're in the Pacific, they're doomed. It's not a nice direction to go, but you can sort of show that these vagrant birds actually are doing it because there might be something wrong with their compass. And finally, one of the funner little migrant bird stories is this little Arctic critter called the meteor. Winters in the Sahel in Africa, and you know, they basically migrate down there. What about the ones in Alaska and Newfoundland? Where do you think they winter?
South America?
Central?
Do they come across the Bering Strait?
They are crazy. But the reason is because they are relatively recent colonists of North America. So the ones in eastern Canada were ones from that sort of slowly expanded their range west from Iceland and Western Europe. The ones in Alaska slowly moved east from Siberia. So their inherent migration thing is still, oh, I'm going to go southwest, I'm going to go southeast. So even though it'd be a lot easier to just go, oh, let's go hang out in Florida for the winter, they cross the Atlantic and go south. And these guys, it's pretty easy to just cross. They just go huge, 9,000 miles. They stop along the way, of course, in the Black Hole Orbit, but birds from Alaska wintering in Kenya. So, just a fun story. Occasionally one of them gets lost as well, and this one was in Warner, New Hampshire, about 5-6 years ago. Every year there's a couple in the Northeast that are just misled again, maybe because their compass is off by 90 degrees. And then in this case, if enough meteors had a compass off by 90 degrees, they're sitting pretty. They end up in eastern US. There's no ocean to cross. There's plenty of presumably things to eat. So it's possible that over more and more generations, we'll all be dead, our grandkids will be dead. Meteors will be a wintering bird in eastern North America. You heard it here first. Should put a little time capsule thing. Oh, please open it in 3 million years. Okay, so that's so who wants to throw out a bird that they don't know the migration route? And I'll tell you if it's an interesting one or not. And if it isn't, I will pick another one.
How about loons?
Loons are kind of boring. They do what harlequin ducks do. They just kind of weave here, they go to the ocean, they go back.
Where are they going?
Loons go to the North Atlantic. Some of them go all the way to Florida, but the ones from around here go to the Gulf of Maine or Long Island Sound. Blue jays is a fun one, because blue jays do migrate. In May or October, you can see flocks of blue jays. They migrate during the day, unlike most of the songbirds. And they kind of do what robins do. And they don't always do it, so they're like a robin plus woodland waxwing. They move when there's not enough acorns. Shift south until they find where acorns are. So a few years ago, I can't remember how many years ago now, blue jays were scarce in New England, in New Hampshire. Because there weren't any acorns, they just moved south. I have a weekly walk that I do that I count birds on. I missed blue jays a few times on that walk. 6.5 mile walk. And I missed blue jay 1 or 2 times. Because they just were gone. And then they came back, and now they're here. And so it was a big acorn failure crop, they'll move again. Chickadees do the same thing. You see chickadees come and go. That was a good question. Any other one to guess another bird?
Are they gone by November, blue jays?
If they're gonna do that migration thing, they usually probably would be by sometime in November. I don't know. It probably varies how many acorns they do have. Anybody want another favorite bird they want to know?
Cardinal.
Okay. Where do cardinals go?
They stay, don't
They
they?
don't migrate at all.
Ah.
Trick question! Yeah, there's a handful of species that do not migrate at all. Cardinals are one. Titmice, downy-haired woodpeckers, pilot woodpeckers. There's very few that don't migrate at all.
What about, but they weren't up here, like when I was.
That's a whole different story. That's like a range expansion, climate change, normal change. Yeah, cardinals were not here in the early 60s. And now they're in Errol.
How about the mourning dove?
Mourning doves. I am not knowing a lot about mourning doves. They do migrate a little bit, and they kind of depend. Oh, excellent. I'll use that as an example of something else. Mourning doves part of it, though. There's something else we have called facultative migration, where birds only migrate if they need to. So, and mourning doves do this. So some years you'll see lots more mourning doves in the winter than others. Blue jays, I guess, would also count in this, but it's really fun. There's a study someone did with yellow-rumped warblers, where in the winter they eat little bayberries on the coast, in the north. So they migrate, maybe from, say, Nova Scotia to Cape Cod. Oh, there's some bayberries here. Yum, yum, chop, chop, chop. And then they use up the bayberries. There's nothing else to eat. They'll keep going until they find more food again. So they kind of just, they don't do a one-stop thing. They go, okay, I'll stop here until I need more food, and I'll go again. So a lot of birds do that. I think mourning does not do that. So it's a fun little story.
What about mockingbirds?
They don't migrate either. That's one of the other ones that doesn't.
Really?
What about hummingbirds?
Okay, now we're going to open the Pandora's box. Yes, hummingbirds migrate. They're leaving shortly, and they go to Central America, and they kind of just fly there. They will fly across the Gulf of Mexico, which is pretty impressive for a tiny little bird like that. They get nice and chubby, and then they go boom. They sometimes land on oil rigs.
I got a question about them, because we have them in our feeder now, and like one will camp out there and keep the rest away. Is it because they're trying to get the young to make their
No,
wings?
so here's what hummingbirds are doing. Hummingbirds evolved in an area without big plastic red flowers, right? And so they're used to having a limited resource out there. Okay, this is a patch of flowers. I need to get my resources. I'm going to defend this patch of flowers. It's all the hummingbirds. You guys find your own food. They haven't figured out that that feeder is like infinite food. And so they will still be defending it. I had the same thing the other day. My hummingbird feeder sits here on my deck. It's one that sits up in a tree, and it's not even eating. It's just
Right.
like it comes like, oh yeah, no, and chases it out. So their little brains are still thinking this is a limited resource. I found a really cool patch of flowers. Any day now, all the nectar in that flower is going to be gone, and I need all of it. You can't have any. So that's what they're doing. It's like you're being territorial about a limited resource.
Gray jays?
What about them? Do they migrate? No. Occasionally they show up in a weird place, but they don't really migrate. All right, we can go on with that all night. If we have more time, we'll do some more of those. So let's talk about bird conservation as it relates to migration right now. I mentioned this before a little bit. Things like stopover sites, these like where the red knot has a relatively small area that it needs for stopping over and feeding. Birds are very vulnerable to those places, whether it's due to something like a wind farm, which is a really, we're not farming wind, we're just harvesting it, we're not actually growing it. But this is a species. Who's heard of Eskimo curlew? Besides Jane. We got a ringer in the back. This bird is extinct. It was basically hunted to death because they were killed by the thousands at stopover sites in the Northeast. They would leave the Arctic Canada, they'd stop in the Northeast to feed on berries and invertebrates, and they were getting really fat. They're doing the double your weight thing to feed fly South America. And they were called doe birds because they were just so fat and delicious, and they just shoot, just like passenger pigeons. They shot hundreds and hundreds of them, and habitat loss in the spring route up the middle of the country also was bad. But yeah, they just, they were very vulnerable because they had only one or two spaces where they would stop to feed, and big numbers of them make them very easy to harvest in that regard. This is not a very happy place for a migrant, unless you land in Central Park. This is New York City. There's a one little green space there, there's others, there's one over there. But, these, tiny little green spaces on the eastern seaboard in particular, I guess Southern California is probably the same way. We've destroyed tons and tons and tons of habitat where birds would theoretically land there to feed and refuel before they continue their journeys. And people have started categorizing stopover habitat in like a three-tier system. Full-service hotels, convenience stores, and fire escapes. And you want, if you're going to be resting and refueling on migration, you want the full-service hotel. Convenience stores, okay, I can get some food there, it's not the best food, but I'll get enough food, I can keep going. Fire escape is, shit, I'm about to die because I can't fly any farther, I'm going to land in your yard. I'm going to land on a fire escape, literally, in downtown Manhattan somewhere, and hopefully there's some food there. And, because of urbanization, we're creating more and more convenience stores and fire escapes, and fewer full-service hotels. And here's, that's just up here. Go down to where winter grounds are. Habitat continues there. This is the hillside of the Dominican Republic. That used to be presumably forest. It is now an eroded, denuded hillside that's probably being used for subsistence agriculture by people down there. And when they can make it through all the gauntlet of stuff going on up here, which we'll get to again in a second, if they get down there, there's no habitat. They're just as bad off as if they, didn't make it there. And here's the gauntlet. This building isn't rye. I hate it. Because what is it? It's all glass. Birds are going to see that building. They're going to get confused at night. Reflections, boom, bam, bam, bam. Wind turbines, not as bad as we think for birds, comparatively speaking. Get to that in a second. Communication towers, actually worse. Little blinking lights hundreds of feet up in the air. Birds see those in the foggy night, go, ah! So the number one cause of human-related bird mortality, so not habitat loss, the number one cause of bird mortality is what? It's not on there.
Windows?
No, that's number two.
Airplanes?
No, that's not even on the chart.
Traffic?
Cars.
Cars is number 4, I thought.
Cats.
Cats. Yeah, Harry gets a cookie. Cats kill 2.4 billion birds a year. We'll get to them in a second. Windows are next at like 500 million. Communication towers are third. Power lines are up there. Wind turbines like down at the bottom. Because by now, wind turbines could get worse because we're getting more and more wind. And hopefully we'll figure out how to do that. But this is part of the gauntlet first have to fix. A little bit of climate change. Climate is changing. We talk about cardinals moving north, mockingbirds moving north. Bird migration can adjust to that or it can't. This is the eastern phoebe, our friendly little phoebes. Their migration date between the 60s and 70s and the 80s and 90s moved up a week in New Hampshire. They don't have the current data, it's harder to get those data now. These guys winter in the southeastern US, where they can get a clue what the weather is like up here because it's the same weather systems, right? So warm weather comes out of Florida, comes up to New Hampshire. So they can track that. Magnolia winters in Central America and has no clue what the weather's doing up here because it's a totally different system. So they haven't advanced. The problem might be, if you're not advancing, but everything else is advancing, like leaves are coming up earlier, bugs are hatching earlier, if you're still an old timer, not intended, if you still haven't changed your migration time, you might get here late enough that you've missed the timing to get the most food for your kids. Or, the other thing that happens with climate change, of course, is we talked about hurricanes and things like that already. Those are increasing. There was a correlation 10 years ago or so with a big drop in chimney swift numbers because of a hurricane that came up the East Coast. And I think it might have been because it might have caused high mortality during the peak of chimney swift migration. It's very sort of arm-wavy explanations, but there's people looking into that sort of thing. And so when we talk about migration, there's actually another little story here. How far you migrate makes a big difference into what your conservation status is. You've got 4 categories here: resident birds, cardinals, mockingbirds, woodpeckers, they don't migrate at all. Short distance, which migrate within the United States. Mid distance goes to the Caribbean, Central America. Long distance goes to South America. Green means species increasing or stable. Yellow means we're not really sure. Red means it's declining. Note the proportion of red from left to right. The farther you migrate, the more likely you are to be declining. Because all these threats, towers, windows, hurricanes, weather, loss of habitat, compound the farther you go. If you just have to go from here to Connecticut, you've probably got a good chance. If you have to go to Tierra del Fuego, you've got to deal with 3,000 plus miles of risk. So it makes a lot of sense. I actually brought some of these with me. They're on the, I've got more in the car if everybody wants one. I saw you've already grabbed one, good job. Good other cookie. These guys, nosing it crazy. They were even reading it before I gave my talk. I saw it. So this is a publication I put out last year, the conservation status of birds in New Hampshire, which goes over some of this. So this is a graph from that, and some of the actions and things like that. So what can we do to help migratory birds? There it is, the evil kitty cat. Who's got a cat? No, right, I've already ruined this. No one's going to admit anything, but it's okay. You have no authority. Who's got a cat? Nobody's a cat. Okay. Does it go outside? Cookie. He hasn't said anything. There's not enough cookies on this side. They're all over there. And he can migrate soon because he's got a lot of cookies. So yeah, cats, keeping cats indoors. The basic plan is, if we can minimize extra unnecessary mortality, the birds have that much of a chance of overcoming all these other things that we're trying to deal with. So we can also make our windows bird friendly. Birds, hit windows. You might have seen those little bird decals, right? Those aren't really that effective because it only blocks this much of the window versus the whole window. So ideally, you do something that actually.
Yeah, but if it looks like a hawk, doesn't it
They have no clue.
more effect? No.
They have no clue. They don't expect to see off. They don't, no. They see reflections, and they won't hit that spot because it's not reflective. If it's in the inside, it's useless entirely. But ideally, like this picture here is all these vertical strips like 4 inches apart, and it's not bad looking. You can still see out the window, and the birds will not hit it as much. And then bird-friendly coffee. Who's heard of bird-friendly coffee? Excellent. Who drinks it?
Beans.
Birds and beans. So birds in the winter. Coffee plantations are basically cornfields in the Costa Rica. They're just this big, barren monoculture full of pesticides and fertilizers, and nothing lives there but coffee. If coffee is grown the traditional way in shade, that overstory forest provides habitat for native birds and migrants that come in for the winter. And so the Smithsonian has started this program that's gone like 20 years now or so, where they certify those farms. They're usually organic, they're usually fair trade as well, so you can get all sorts of little check marks off your thing. And, it's providing habitat for birds versus natural house, which is just this big, most coffee is not shade grown, but if you can find shade grown coffee, you can do a little tiny bit. Our birds in the winter. And there we go. So there's a state of the birds thing again, some more birds migrating. You know what those are? Real good quiz.
Oh, those sandhill cranes?
Oh my God, this guy's good. How'd you know? You been there?
I was going to ask you about sandhill cranes. Well, these people know sandhill cranes. They're
Yeah.
from Nebraska.
This isn't current.
But we have 4 sandhill cranes. I'm from Central Mass,
Yeah.
and there have been 4 sandhill cranes all summer in Hardwick, this little town, nearby us, and they haven't left. I mean, they just
They're
kinda
nesting.
landed there, and that's where they're living.
They're nesting. Sandhill cranes, thank you. Get your cookies. Sandhill cranes have been slowly moving east as a breeding species over the last 20 years. They now breed 2 or 3 pairs a year in New Hampshire. There's a bunch in Maine, and there's a couple places, Massachusetts, Vermont, New York, is full of them
All
now.
right, so they are
They're just
expanding.
slowly moving east, so they,
Well,
yeah.
that answers the
There's still not as
question.
many as these guys had in Nebraska,
Now,
but yeah. they're
you
moving
mentioned a bird banding in Auburn. Were you talking about Auburn, Mass?
east.
There's
No,
a-
Auburn, New Hampshire.
Okay, because there's a big bird banding group at a sportsman's club in Auburn, Massachusetts.
There's Auburn, Mass.
It's in central Mass, right near Worcester.
Okay, yeah, I don't know that part of
No.
Minnesota, so I don't know that. No, it's New Hampshire has a nature center in Auburn, New Hampshire,
Oh, okay.
which is where we have Watch Tower. So, yeah, I don't know about that one. Any other questions? Wow, I answered everything. Or he did.
Oh, yeah.
Is it better to leave the birds in their state of, in their sanctuary for them to be feeding on their own, or feed them and get them out of the same, you know?
So, yeah, so basically you're asking, is bird feeding a good thing? Kind of?
Well, is it better for, it's like something in the wild is
Right.
eating their own food and foraging in the wild versus humans feeding
Right.
the animal.
So, all the data we have, people have cited this multiple times, bird feeding doesn't really affect the birds in a significant way. I always say this, bird feeding is for our enjoyment, not for their sustenance. So it does not make them dependent on us for food. If you suddenly, you're up here in the summer, you've got a hummingbird feeder out, you leave and you go back to Massachusetts or whatever, and you take it down before they've left, they will find food. If I go on vacation to Costa Rica for 2 weeks in the winter and my bird feeder gets brought in, they will find food. They've been living in New Hampshire in the winter for more than 200 years, which is how long we've been here, and are doing just fine. So they are not going to get dependent on our food. The only problem is if there's disease, the house finch disease that was going around every now and then, and they can spread disease at feeders. But there's certainly no evidence anywhere for birds being dependent on feeders. So put bird feeders out, enjoy the birds, don't put them out when the bears are there. And yeah, that doesn't really bother them or do anything, doesn't really affect the behavior in significant ways, with a few tiny exceptions. So, is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, are they nesting in the trees or the shrubs?
Depends on what species it is. They'll be all over the place. There might be some you'll see them bring the young to the feeders again in the, this time of year. Like baby downy woodpeckers are just chowing on my suet all this last 4 weeks or so. Which is on the second floor window, so the bears can't get it. Cool. Anything else? Cool, you can turn in your cookie tally to Harry. That's in our LBC. There might be one in there, we should give him one, he definitely.
So if you have wetlands and you want to prune down some shrubs and stuff, is
Yeah.
there something that you want to be aware of? Not.
Yeah, I would, you mean just so you can see things better or something? Do it in the winter for starters, then the birds will just deal with it and come back. So they wouldn't be affecting nests or anything. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.